Some failures are awful and you might never get over them, but the one thing I can guarantee is that you will learn something from them. I'd always wanted to write books from the age of 4. So I had a lot of hope for this novel. And so it got published, it went out into the world. When you say a savaging, that's too complimentary. They all absolutely hated it, but not only that, they egged each other on to detest it even more. I still see my divorce as a failure, but I no longer see failure as a negative. To face up to that took me a really long time. I felt so ashamed that all of my loved ones had come to that wedding and had made an effort to interrupt their lives to celebrate that union, and it hadn't worked out, not for want of trying on my part.
When you think of your biggest failures, what do you think of?
If you don't mind, I probably won't talk that much about it. It might derail this conversation because I'm still very much in it.
I'm so excited for this. This is one of those podcasts that's like very selfish that I just like love to talk to you. I have binged your podcast so many times. I regularly go through and you know when you just like save a load of them so that they're just in your little podcast save folder.
I actually never knew you could do that. First of all, thank you so much. But so secondly, wow, that's so enlightening.
So I do it probably like once every month. I go through it's on Spotify.
Okay.
This podcast is not sponsored by Spotify. It could be. Email me.
No, I love Spotify. I'm not on Spotify either, but love them.
Yeah. And so I go through all of my favourite podcasts and there's like that little plus button.
Okay.
And if you save them on that, it goes to a Your Episodes playlist.
Oh, well,
yeah.
Look, you see, this is why I wanted to come on this podcast. I've learned something already. That's going to transform my life. Thank you.
It's so useful. Yeah. And so then, because I find I will see someone talk about a podcast on social media and I won't want to listen to it right then in the moment, but then I'll forget about it. So I go and save them all. So there's Your Podcast and Your Episodes. Your Episodes are specific ones that you've saved. Your podcast is just like all the ones you follow.
Okay.
Which I love.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Teaching people new things every day. Every day is a school day. To set the scene on your kind of career and where you are now, I'd love to get a whistle-stop tour of from the beginning up to now.
Okay.
Big ask.
Fine. In 3 words or fewer. So I was born in Epsom, a little town in Surrey, and lived there for the first 4 years of my life. And my dad, he's now retired, but he was a surgeon and he got a job in the north of Ireland, which is where his mother, my grandmother was from. And we moved over to Northern Ireland when I was 4 in 1982. Moved just outside Derry. It was like quite a rough time to be in that particular part of the world because there was essentially a civil war going on, a lot of sectarian violence, and a lot of military checkpoints to get through on our way to school, and balaclavaed men marching in the streets in August, which is quite a surreal thing to go through as a child because you sort of just accept it wholesale.
I can imagine.
As this is my life. And it's only relatively recently that I've looked back and thought, oh no, that left me with some stuff.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Ireland, and if you've ever watched Derry Girls, that was absolutely my era, my experience. And I went to secondary school in Belfast. Fun fact, same secondary school as Jamie Dornan. We bonded over that when he came on How to Fail. And I didn't have a very good time at that school, partly because I still spoke with an English accent. And so there were various assumptions made about me.
Right, especially because of the current state.
Exactly. So at that time, if you spoke with an English accent, there were assumptions made that you were part of the British military, which we weren't as a family, but I can understand why that assumption was made and why people dislike me because of it. So I didn't have a great time, and I ended up sitting a scholarship exam for a boarding school in England and got it, and then started going to boarding school in Malvern in the West Midlands. And I was there from the age of 13 to 18. And then I was lucky enough to get good A-levels and to go to Cambridge, which I'm so unbelievably grateful for. Had an amazing time at university, loved my subject, did a history degree, but did lots of student journalism while I was there. And I'd always known that I wanted to be a writer. And I was very lucky that I met some key people along the way who encouraged me and supported me in that. So from a very young age, I was writing for my local newspaper at the age of 12.
Sorry, what?
It's so mad to say
I
that
was
now.
playing hopscotch.
Yeah, well, I was too, but when I wasn't playing hopscotch, I was writing a fortnightly column for the Derry Journal
About hopscotch.
Actually, my first ever column for them was about Australian soap stars and how I wish they'd stop releasing music, which totally dates me.
Oh my god,
It's like the
but
Kylie
also
Jason
great.
era.
I
know.
love the like firm opinions. I feel like if I'd written something at 12, I would have like really strong opinions, whereas
Yes.
now I'm like, oh yeah, I don't want to upset
100%.
anyone.
I could not agree more, Grace. I actually feel like I look back at myself and I think, how blissful must it have been to be that sure of what I thought?
Yeah.
And I didn't have a column then for many, many, many years because it honestly took me about like 3 decades to build up my confidence in what I thought again.
Really interesting, because I think the same about the beginning of my like YouTube career.
Really?
Because I was just so completely naive, and also like beautiful naivety, like literally just being able to be like, no, but I believe in this. And I always talked about like politics and like everything. And it's all, a lot of it is stuff that kind of I very much still believe now. It was very, very, in terms of like talking about like the abortion referendum, all of this, things I would still very much talk about, but I talked in like so fearlessly, in so much detail, in like any sort of situation, like absolutely no fear about that, about other opinions, about everything, and like literally did not even faze me in the slightest. So I'd be like, honestly, if you don't agree, fuck you.
It's so
It's so
interesting that,
weird.
because I do think there's instinct and there's ignorance.
Yeah.
Like when you don't know what you don't know,
Right.
you feel much more confident in expressing yourself. And what you were saying, that some of your political views are absolutely the same. Instinctively, you sort of know that.
Yeah.
And instinct is very important, particularly as women, to hold on to.
Yeah.
But ignorance is obviously very important to get rid of. But the more you know, the more you realise what you don't know. Yeah, exactly. And the more you worry about how it's going to be received.
Which is exactly, I think, because it's not that any of those things I don't stand by now, and I still make sure to be, I'm probably like very political as it kind of compared to, what you might see as an influencer. And I'm like proud of that. But I did just very much have that like ballsiness of being like, kind of assumed I knew everything as well, was really happy to like, I went on fucking like Daily Politics and just was like, wow, this. And like now I would, it's not that I don't kind of believe in the same things at all. It's more like I want to make sure that I know every single thing about a topic before I talk about it, like all of these different things, because I'm just older and more mature, and there's actually part of that I should probably be able to get rid of, and just people pleasery stuff as well, wanting to make sure that it's, that I make sure that there's every single part of the argument and I caveat it with all the appropriate points, and actually it's probably just more helpful at points to just be like, no, this is what I believe in.
And I know we're going off on a tangent here, and I will go back to my career path shortly.
I intend to do many tangents.
I do think that's so interesting, because I also think some people get away with not knowing very much, but are arrogant and entitled,
right, and
just put themselves forwards.
Yes.
And the mind sort of boggles sometimes. They're all around us, and they're the ones who quite often get airtime. And sometimes when I'm feeling insecure about myself, I think, okay, I'm going to imagine the most arrogant, entitled person of my acquaintance, or even just a sort of hypothetical fictional character, and I'm going to pretend that I have just 5% of their ego, and see what a difference that makes.
Yeah.
Because otherwise there's an internal narrative. I'm doing it right now. I'm questioning what I'm saying and whether I'm saying it accurately enough. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I think it also comes with having a podcast, because you listen to things back and you're instantly like, oh, actually that came across quite patronising, or that came across, not fully considered. And then you make sure the next time you say that, you don't say it in that way, even though if that was in normal conversation, no one would probably pick up on it. Yeah. But it's like a self-policing thing. It's like when people talk about, with imposter syndrome, and then you start saying, well, just embrace it, like, as, instead flip it on its head and have like fraudulent conman syndrom, and just start being like, I'm amazing, like who cares if I'm in this place, like I will now embrace this place that I am in completely, and you can't get me out of it, so I might as well do it well. And actually it's so true that people there's kind of more airtime given to less consideration.
Dare I say it? Dare I say it? The fraudulent conman syndrome says yes. A lot of white male fronted podcasts actually just get away with stuff, and some of them are so brilliant, but get away with stuff that I don't think I would get away with as a woman.
No,
I think I'm more policed. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, I could not agree more. It's really interesting. We we said the other day that I should record word for word a podcast that was done in that way. So like someone who's generally considered, you know, well-spoken, like any of these things, and record word for word, and I promise you I'd get cancelled for it.
It's fascinating. I had a really interesting conversation with Caitlin Moran in this sort of area, where she was saying that quite often that assumption of privilege and also one's awareness that we should say and check ourselves when we are talking about something that affects myriad people, not just us, is often used to do women down, or to do marginalised people of any gender down, who are not born into a world made in their image, where it makes us question our own competence.
No, I think it is really, really, really interesting. I think the point about successful men is like definitely very, very prevalent. I think if you think of all of the big people in the public eye, I genuinely think that you will know a lot more about the women's backgrounds and where they came from and what they did have and what they didn't have, versus like, I think of any single of the, you know, people who've raised huge, it's just my sector, but people who've raised huge rounds, like founders who've raised huge funding rounds, who've like posted about it. And I've never once thought, oh, like, I wonder what background they came from, because I assume that it's possible regardless. Yeah. And that's the problem. That's the thing. It puts it on a back foot because you think there must be something here, which is important to know, and it's very important to contextualize, and it's very important for people like me to constantly contextualize that, because I don't want anyone to think like, you know, they're just not working hard enough or whatever it might be. But I think it's, you know, let's add the other people into the mix too in terms of contextualizing. Yeah. So I think that's very, very interesting.
I graduated from Cambridge, and then I got work experience at the Evening Standard newspaper on their Londoners' Diary column, which is like a gossip column. And within a week, and this is the first and only time it's ever happened to me, that work experience translated into a job.
Oh, wow.
Because I managed to bring in a scoop. and they gave me a job, and they said that they would train me during that first year, which was great, because I was going to do either like a postgrad journalism course or go and work on a local newspaper and kind of work my way up. So I was on the Evening Standard for a year, and then I went to the Sunday Telegraph for a 3-month trial as a news reporter, and that turned into a job. And I was there for 3 years. Then I went as a feature writer to the Mail on Sunday, because I knew that I wanted to write features. Like, writing's always been what's drawn me to journalism. It wasn't an ideal paper for me, but it was an ideal job. I was there for a year, and then I got my dream job, which was on The Observer as a feature writer there. And I was 29 when I got that job. I spent 8 years there. There were amazing things that I learned. And it also taught me a lot about myself, because at the end of those 8 years, my life in various ways imploded. I had got married to the wrong person. I got divorced. I left The Observer with no job to go to. I went freelance, and it was one of the best decisions I could ever have made. And alongside all of that, I was writing novels. So I wrote my first novel, Scissors, Paper, Stone, came out when I was 32, I think. And since then, I've written 5 novels and 2 nonfiction books.
Wow.
And then I also launched How to Fail, the podcast. Yeah. And we can talk a bit more about that, about how on paper it seemed like my career was successful in certain ways, but in my personal life, it absolutely didn't feel like that. Yeah. And it was the disconnect between those two things that actually prompted my desire to have more open discussions about failure.
And before we get onto the podcast itself, I remember that you said that when you, I think in 2012, when you released your first book, is that right? Yeah. The first kind of 2 reviews you read of it just completely savaged you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was a really great lesson, one that was uncomfortable to live through. So my first novel, Scissors, Paper, Stone, came out at the beginning of 2012, and I think anyone who has ever produced anything and put it out into the public forum might relate to this, where when you're creating something, you can exist in quite a nice bubble. Of course, it's hard work to create, but you exist in a nice bubble of thinking, I'm creating something really meaningful, and it will have meaning for lots of people who I've never even met. Right. And it might just change the landscape. So I had all of these things in my head. I was like, it could be, Like, it could be that people really love this book. And that's sort of a trick, I think, that your brain plays in order to get you through it, in order to get you through what can be quite a hard creative process. So I had a lot of hope for this novel. And it was incredibly important to me because I'd always wanted to write books. From the age of 4, I loved books and wanted to write them. And so it got published and it went out into the world. And the first review that I ever watched was an Irish late night cultural discussion programme. And I knew that they had chosen the book to talk about, and my publicist was very excited. I was like, they never really talk about debut novels. I think it's the first time they've done it. It's really great that they picked it. And I watched it the next day on my laptop at my then kitchen table. And when you say a savaging, that's too complimentary. It was 3 commentators and the kind of the presenter, and they all absolutely hated it. But not only that, they egged each other on to detest it even more.
Right.
And I remember at one point, one of them saying, you know, it's so bad, it's not even her fault. I want to know who the editor was who allowed this out into the world. And I was like, sitting there, bawling my eyes out.
I can imagine.
Closed the laptop and rang one of my closest friends, Simon, who works in the art world, and he gave me a really amazing piece of advice, which has never left me. And he said, the thing about great art is that you want it to trigger big opinions. You want people to love it, and that means that people are also going to hate it.
Yeah.
The worst possible thing you can do if you have aspirations to create something meaningful is to have a mediocre response of people being like, yeah, it was okay.
That's very true. And that is a great piece of advice.
It was an amazing piece of advice. The second review I had was in the Evening Standard, my former paper. I've never forgotten the name of the person who wrote it.
Really?
I'm a Scorpio. I do bear grudges. And this person just spent the whole review comparing me unfavourably to another more successful author called Zoe Heller, who I absolutely love and adore Zoe Heller's writing. But I wasn't trying to be Zoe Heller. It was quite bizarre that they'd chosen to compare me. She didn't have a book out or anything. And I just thought that's really unfair. That one really rankled because it felt unjust.
It's not like someone said on the front being like, oh, the new Zoe Heller.
Not at all.
It's like deciding to say like my book and deciding to be like Simon Sinek and being like, well, it's not. And it's like, I'd literally recommend you to buy it.
Is it?
Literally, like, but I'd like, it's like I'd recommend you to buy that one. Like, as in, like, it's not. Yeah, I don't know. It's I can imagine it put you in a place where you're like, I don't know. Reviews are hard as well because it's not like, first of all, you don't need to back yourself up, but you also automatically have no voice. And I think that's the point. And you don't need to have a voice, and you need to be fine with it not being a positive review. And like, I made a deal with myself that like, weirdly, because I'm in the public eye, before even my book came out, the only reviews on there were just hate comments, and so people could review it before the book even came out. And I was like, oh my god, how am I ever going to deal with this? Because it's just, the book's not even out yet, and the only reviews it's got has been people giving like 1-star reviews, and it like killed me because I was like, guys, like, I'm working so hard on this, and you don't even, I think people assumed it would be a very certain thing. I remember there was like a tweet that went viral of someone being like, oh, it's gonna, it's just, I can only imagine it's going to be, a very classic XYZ. And like the whole reason for writing it had been kind of completely different. And it wasn't a memoir, and it wasn't, all of those things. But I remember being like, oh my God, I'm actually going to just cancel it. I'm going to pay back the advance. Like, I'm not going to do it. But actually, really what it was a lesson for me was kind of like, I'm in the public eye. There's always, if you're ever going to leave a review before a book's out, it's only ever going to be negative if you're going out of your way to do that. Otherwise it would be, I guess, false advertising. And just being fine with the fact that, like, if you're going to put something out, it's not necessarily going to be received in the way you want it to. It also, there are going to be people who hate things. Like, there are pieces of writing I hate that other people love. And it's not necessarily trolling in any way. It's just like, there are different people with different tastes. Every single good book I read, I go on the Goodreads because I like to read the reviews after I've read it. And I like go on it and I'm like, because it will be like my favourite book ever, and there'll be someone like 1-star being like, this is the worst thing. And I'm like, I want to argue with them.
Yeah, Goodreads are really harsh, but you're so right. And the thing that I keep coming back to, which is a kind of evolution of what Simon was saying, is that there are some people in this world who don't like cheese. Now, I can't personally relate to that because I absolutely love cheese. And I'm half Swiss, so it's part of my cultural heritage. But isn't that interesting? Like, I don't think they're wrong. I mean, well, I probably do, but I don't think that they're bad people.
Yeah.
Because it's just a question of taste. And in the same way, I met my husband on Hinge. I went through loads of really disappointing dates from dating apps. And people were not the right fit. We were not the right fit for each other. That doesn't make us bad people. It just makes us people who are shaped by our own emotional baggage and our own life experience to view things a certain way and to need certain things. And so I've become a lot, it's still really hard. I care what people think. And I think that's a good thing because I like to believe I'm empathetic. So I have to care what people think and feel. But I've definitely got better at metabolizing negative criticism now and understanding that it's not a wholesale definition on me as a person.
I also think that the times in my life that I've got caught so much, being in the public eye, I personally don't think you can be a people pleaser. I don't think you should either not be in the public eye or not. But just as in, you can have it as an inherent like part of you, but you actively have to act against it, I think. Yes. Otherwise, you are going to live your entire life in hell because you are just going to constantly, and that's literally, I mean, that was part of the reason why I decided to stop YouTube. It's part of the reason I decided to change my career, just because I was like, do you know what? This isn't good for me. And I also want to keep the part of myself that wants to make people around me happy to an extent. Yeah. I don't want to keep the part of myself that essentially just like loses myself in the way of pleasing other people. But I do want to keep my empathy. I want to keep my kindness. I want to keep all of these things. And so I was like, not the career for me. Great, cool, move on. But I really think it's very interesting because the times that I've got caught so much in people pleasing have been the times that I also think I've come across the worst, because it's always me trying to like make sure that I appeal to this person and this person and this person and don't make anyone upset and all of this. And the people I like to consume on social media, they have their strong opinions, they stick to them, and then they're also like if you don't, I literally complain about me in your group chat, honestly rip me to shreds. And I've had to consciously channel that so much because I've been like, it's also doing me a disservice, both my mental health and also it's doing the opposite of people pleasing in terms of the way that I you want
the way that you want to show up in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good thing to remember, is that culturally a lot of people have been taught that to be a people pleaser is nice.
Right.
And a generous thing and a selfless thing. And actually when you take it to its extreme, it isn't, because what I did in my years of extreme people pleasing was I outsourced my sense of self to other people's opinions of me. Worse than that, to my perception of other people's opinions of me. And I never took the time to know myself and to understand what I wanted and what my desires were. And that led me into bad relationships, toxic work situations where I was incapable of standing up for myself or showing up as myself. And actually that puts the burden of that work on other people. And so I find that a very helpful thing to remember, that it's not being selfish to stop people pleasing. It's actually the opposite.
Yeah, and it's actually quite hard to, I think, we think, as you say, we think of people pleasing as a good, like a moral good, but then actually when we look at how it affects the people around us, how it affects our relationships, like all of these things, like it's even in a relationship, for example, it's not good to be with the wrong person, as in like you don't know that most of the time, and it'll come out in the end. And also I fully believe that some relationships are only meant to last a certain amount of time and aren't meant to be your whole life, just because of the way that we kind of society perceives it. But it's not nice for you and it's not nice for someone else. So I think getting out of your mind that people pleasing has a good end, because I think we think that people pleasing is kind of selfless, as you say, for this end of everything being better. Actually, I kind of see it as a lose-lose. Yes. And that is separating the traits of empathy and kindness, which I think are really important. But I don't think you can be empathetic and kind without being empathetic and kind to yourself. Because as you say, you just completely lose yourself and you're unable to be a good friend to other people. I also find that in toxic work situations, toxic relationships, toxic friendships, I disproportionately spend my time trying to please those people, and I still find myself doing that, and I like get happier when it's like fine, and all of these things. And that's as someone who cuts people off quite easily, and I kind of consider myself someone who's like protects my peace, but there are still very people pleasery traits in me that I disproportionately kind of go towards that end. And then it's like, for all of the other friends that are amazing to me and all of the other bits of work that are amazing, it's like, no, I need to spend more time on those people.
Do you know what Myers-Briggs personality type you are?
Yes.
What are you?
I am the protagonist one.
Okay.
Which is EN, either TJ or FJ.
Okay. I'm an INFJ. Which is super. And what I do know about the INFJ is that we have very high tolerance and patience, and will put up with a lot of stuff, and probably are a bit people pleasery. But there'll come a point where you have filled that jug up too much, and when it starts spilling over, we're done.
Well,
we
that's
slam
really
the door and we're done.
That sounds.
And when you said you can let people go, like it was so interesting to me when I realised this, because I do consider myself an empathetic person, and I couldn't compute how I could be empathetic but also close the door on people and just be like, I'm done. And that's why. That's
so interesting. That could not sound more like me. I was talking to Tala's managing director the other day. We have every week we have like an hour-long meeting where we go through all different areas of the company, but we also, touch base with each other. It's a very demanding job, checking we're all okay, all of this. So we often talk about kind of personal things as well. And she was saying to me, she was like, I have never met someone who cuts things off so easily that don't serve them anymore. It's like I get to a point and I put up, exactly what you say, I put up with so much, and I will go to the ends of the earth for the people around me, and especially because I'm in a particularly fortunate position, I consider it a way where it's like, I see my friends work so hard. Like, I want people to be happy. I want to be able to help people as much as possible. The second, and it will just be like that, like the second I'm pushed too far, it's like I wake up one morning and I'm just like, nope, don't have any attachment to it, and it's literally just gone.
I think you're an ENFJ, because if you're extrovert.
Yeah, although I think as I've grown up, I haven't done the test for a few years. I think as I've grown up, I might have moved to introvert, or I think I'm far more, I present as extroverted definitely if someone like meets me, because I'm very like chatty and hopefully quite friendly and all of this, but I cannot deal with more than about half an hour of a social situation.
Okay, well then, maybe you're closer to me than I thought. But I do think the older I've got as well, the more I realise that even when a relationship is over or a friendship is in a different phase, I can still think of that with love.
Yeah.
Because I totally agree with you. For me, a relationship is not a failure just because it ends. It is part of shaping our personal landscape, in the same way that a volcano can shape a landscape and then remain dormant for many, many years. I can still think of those relationships with love. So when I say that I shut the door, it's almost like that enables me then to think of them with love. Because to enable something toxic to keep on going and to keep pleasing whatever energy that is, you're going to find it very difficult to think fondly of them.
Yeah.
Letting it go actually is more loving sometimes.
Yeah.
That's what I've realised relatively recently.
I think that's really, really true. And I think that very much kind of comes into the people-pleasing thing, is it's essentially saying, you get to a point where you can't please either of you anymore, and you get to that kind of cut-off point, and almost by moving past that and like closing the door, you're able to, just able to, I guess, detach yourself and move on. And I think there's an important lesson there for anyone who kind of has people-pleasing tendencies. And I think probably most people do, I would say, especially women. I'm not sure if that's fair to say. But I would say that given we are meant to be nice to deal with at all times, I would say that kind of probably very much comes into it. And therefore, sometimes stopping people pleasing in terms of cutting something off is the kindest thing you can do to both them and you, and actually pleases more people in the end. I want to talk then, you just spoke briefly about kind of relationships and not necessarily seeing that as a failure. I know that before you started the podcast, having just gone through your divorce, I know that in that time you did kind of see it as a failure. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I think also I still see my divorce as a failure, but I no longer see failure as a negative.
Right.
So
okay, interesting.
Yes. So obviously there are negative things that come about as a result of failure, but I'm incredibly grateful for it now. But there's no getting away from the fact that that marriage ended and failed, and when we were walking down the aisle, neither of us thought that would be the case.
Yeah.
And not only that, it felt so shameful. And I don't know whether anyone listening to this who has been through a divorce or a public breakup can sort of relate to this, where I felt so ashamed that all of my loved ones had come to that wedding and had bought us gifts and had made an effort to interrupt their lives to celebrate that union, and it hadn't worked out, and not for want of trying on my part. And to face up to that took me a really long time. It took me, I think, a year within the marriage itself. It was a very slow motion thing, and there were lots of conversations and lots of therapy again on my part. And actually, it was a very difficult thing to go through. And I look back now and I realise I was depressed.
Right.
And my best friend Emma, who is also a psychotherapist, which is an amazing combination.
Very helpful. I'm
helpful.
Looking for one of those if anyone wants to be my friend.
You can't have her as a best friend, but you could have her as your therapist. She's incredible.
Perfect.
And she describes it as the perspex screen time, where she would sit down opposite me and feel like she couldn't get to me, that she was knocking on a perspex screen. There was this sort of avatar of me, but I wasn't in touch. I was numb. I wasn't in touch with my own feelings. And I now realise that that's a symptom of, it was mild depression for me, but and luckily sort of therapy and Emma and my friends and family got me through that. So there was no doubting that it felt like a failure. And after that divorce, I thought, okay, so I failed at this. What does that mean? And I looked at it and I realised that what it meant was I didn't know what was going to happen next, because life had not gone according to my plan. And that can be very scary, but it can also be liberating, because you think, well, what do I actually want to fill?
You've suddenly given a blank slate.
Exactly.
Which I think it's really interesting. And I think what feeds into this a lot, I think a lot about the, obviously the timeline put on women in terms of like settling down, getting married if you choose to, having children, like the traditional, not just societal pressures, but like kind of everything, you know, just like all different sides of the pressures that come into that. And looking at like the statistics of like how most, actually like the majority of breakups happen around like late 20s, where people are thinking, actually, no, this is not going to be the person I'm going to be with. And also the amount of people who stick with something because they think, well, if I'm gonna do it, like I guess it's gonna be now. And I can imagine there are so many people, even listening to this, who probably have that kind of mindset of thinking that because there's this kind of pressure, it has to be, you know, delivered. It has to be delivered within that time. And so what if it's the wrong person? Or so what if there's that kind of like feeling? Also probably who are, you know, as you say, already married and already kind of in that situation. And you almost think it's that like sunk cost fallacy where you think, well, I've invested time into this. All my friends and family have come to a day. We've said we're completely in love. We've bought, you know, like we've made a life together. I guess we're in this now. I can imagine it took you a long time to even recognize that actually that didn't have to be it. And you could move on from that. But I can imagine that being terrifying.
It was terrifying. I was lucky and unlucky in a way. So part of what contributed to the breakdown of that relationship was fertility treatment and a difficult and challenging fertility journey, which during the course of 1 year, I did 2 rounds of IVF back to back, both unsuccessful. Then I became pregnant naturally and I had a miscarriage at 3 months. And that was a lot to go through in a single year. And we can talk more about that, because that's a huge part of why particularly women who want to have biological children, why they feel there is a timeline. But what it did mean was that I didn't have children to consider. So if you are in a relationship and you do have children, I'm not even going to pretend that my experience is anything compared to yours, because that's so difficult. And actually my now husband, he is divorced and has 3 kids. And I see how brilliantly he and his ex co-parent, but how difficult that is and how challenging it is and how you feel that you've let your children down at every single juncture. And so there's a lot more to consider if there are other people involved. And I absolutely a huge believer in working as much as possible in a committed relationship to try and sustain it. But if you've done all of that and it's still not working, then I promise you, you are not a failure.
Yeah.
You have worked and tried your hardest, and the relationship might fail, but you're not a failure. You're actually really, really strong for being able to acknowledge that. And there is always life on the other side of it. And I think the thing about plans, for me, failure, my definition of failure is when something doesn't go according to plan. You have to then question the plan.
Yeah.
Where did you get it from?
Yeah.
Who told you that you had to be a certain way? Because quite often, the people you're getting that advice from are not people that you should be taking advice from. It could be an inner critic. It could be a strict teacher. It could be an unloving parent. It could be society itself with all of its patriarchal nonsense. It could be that you've watched too many 1980s rom-coms, as I did, and that you have a very heteronormative, conventional sense of what you think you should be like in your 20s and 30s. And I'm here to say that none of that needs to inform how you feel about yourself. That actually it's so much more valid and so much more crucial to take the time to know who you are and what you want for yourself right now, rather than projecting 5-10 years in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that is such a valuable piece of advice. And I think we also all need to hear that kind of over and over, because I think every time I think I've internalized that, I realize that I'm not acting upon that. And I think that, you know, it takes me double the amount of time to realize those things when I have the either like societal views or, you know, self-imposed kind of, I guess, plans in terms of what I thought my life would be like, or my career would be like, or my relationships would be like in whatever way. And it is so tough to get out of that. And I think when you have not only society, but kind of biology and like all of these things on top of it, it's just like, it's an absolute minefield. And I hate to think how many people out there are sitting there thinking they either just need to stay in that position, or think that because they didn't stay in that, it is, as you say, well, it can be a failure, as you say, but that's not a positive, and that you didn't, I'm sure you'll think, I mean, putting words in your mouth, but I'm sure there's so much you learnt out of that position too, that in your relationship now and in your marriage now, you were able to kind of see,
huge.
Actually, almost thank God.
Yes. Oh, massively, thank goodness. And we've both learnt so much from our failed relationships that we can bring into our relationship now and do differently. And also, I think it teaches you when you get divorced, or when a long-term relationship ends, or when you get fired from a job that you thought was a certain thing, not only does it force you to reevaluate, but it makes you realize how fragile things are. And so the knock-on effect of that for me has been that I don't take anything for granted. I feel so lucky. And I also would hate the idea of anyone listening to this feeling like they're not worth opportunity, because there are so many people who live in this world who don't get the multiple opportunities that I have had to fail. That are people who, for whatever reason, their ethnicity, their background, their financial situation, are not given as many opportunities to fail. Are perceived differently. And I want those people to know that they are worth and worthy of opportunities and taking risks. And that's easy for me to say, and the risk will always come at a greater cost. But I do passionately believe in that, that we are all worthy of opportunity and of second chances, and third and fourth and fifth.
I couldn't
up to
agree
infinite
more.
number.
Yeah. How did it get from this point where you were kind of, as you say, feeling like a little bit of a failure? And, you know, you'd had recent things like you'd had a few years before, I guess, your first novel had come out. You'd had a series of these things that I'm sure from an outward perspective, it probably looked like you were doing really well, and that's just a career and all of these different things. But I know that you've said before that you kind of like struggled with those things. How did that lead to you starting the podcast?
Yeah. So after my divorce, I thought to myself, well, I'm going to do things differently now. I've learned so much. I'm going to make different decisions. And I got into a relationship about a year after with a lovely man. He was much younger than I was. I mean, not that much, 9 years younger. But I guess at that stage, you know, that is quite a big difference, because I was in my mid to late 30s then. And that relationship lasted for about 2 years and then didn't work out because we were both at different phases. And I found that utterly devastating, because we broke up 3 weeks before my 39th birthday. And I was like, well, here I am again, single, without the children that I long for. And I just don't know what I'm doing. And that's the moment that I felt most like a failure in my own life. And I looked back at my 30s And I realized that for every time that I had failed or that things had gone wrong, I'd also survived. And that gave me this weird sense of strength and empowerment.
Yeah.
And I was like, how interesting that there's that ambiguity. And so I started having more conversations with my friends about how that felt. And I realized that those conversations were really rewarding. And at the same time as I was having those conversations and sort of coming to terms with various things in my personal life, in my professional life, I felt like I'd never really been brave enough to be myself. Right. And I think that that's quite a common feeling for anyone in their 20s and 30s. I was in a role where I was often sent to interview celebrities for newspapers. And I got very frustrated that they were always so formulaic, those interviews, that it was always about the latest movie they were promoting and how so-and-so was great to work with. And let me tell you about my Oscar. And any time that there was a moment where I could veer off course and try and have a very human connection, that piece of writing would always end up edited out. And so I felt quite frustrated by that. And so it was those things came together and I thought I want to have conversations about things going wrong.
Yeah.
And to give lie to the image of curated perfection that we were all so used to seeing on social media. And podcasts were just starting, really. Yeah. I mean, I kind of listened.
Was this?
It was 2018. I listened to Serial and loved it.
Yeah,
and Esther
but that
Perel.
was right at the beginning.
It was. And so I thought, oh, here's an opportunity, because it was actually a very open, democratic form. Yeah. Where all you needed was like a mic and some idea. I mean, I drew my own logo, as you can probably tell. I DM'd a hummus company for sponsorship. I eBayed my old wedding dress to cover a sound engineer for that first season. And I just started having conversations about failure with people who said yes to me. And it was an amazing thing. I thought it would last for a season, and I thought it would just be 8 guests and that would be it. And I would have done something that I was proud of, where I did feel like I was being myself. And then it snowballed, and to my immense and grateful surprise, other people wanted to hear those conversations too.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised at all, because it's one of those ideas where you look back and you're like, why the hell weren't people talking about it? But it makes so much sense. I also think that it's so interesting that in like traditional celebrity and Hollywood musicians, etc., the aim is to be put on a pedestal. Like the aim is to have almost like no perception of failure. Like there's absolutely no, there's nothing that went wrong. There's no, there's only like a rags to riches story afterwards, but there's never like the little blips along the way that I even talked about, or they're kind of everywhere all over the news and it's like ripping that person apart. Whereas in digital first celebrity or well-known people, it's almost completely the opposite.
That's so interesting.
It's
and true.
It's like you get you get highlight reels, of course, and no matter how much failure you see on like an influencers or kind of podcasters or someone who's come up through whatever digital channel has talked about, like will definitely be a highlight reel, but you almost always, I guess, they have to talk about these things because there's such an instant feedback loop that if they didn't, it would be like, what the hell are you on about? But I think at that time that hadn't truly been established. And to be able to hear the other side, almost to be able to hear traditional celebrity in a way that you would hear online people talking about their failures and actually giving insight into their lives, I think you can see why people would be so incredibly interested in that.
I can now. That's what I need to say. And you're so right. And also the other place where failure was spoken about openly was Silicon Valley at that stage. Right. And you will know a lot more about this than I do. But when I researched my book, How to Fail, which came out a few months after the podcast had started, which again was not something I'd ever anticipated. I never thought I would write nonfiction. Yeah. My then editor approached me when the podcast started being like, I think there's a book in this. And one of the things that I found was that in Silicon Valley, there is this kind of macho bro culture, or there was then, of fail fast, fail often, break things to create things. And there were certain venture capitalists who would only invest funds if the entrepreneur in front of them had failed 3 times already,
Mm-hmm.
because they knew that that individual would have learned so much from that.
That's
time.
so interesting. And I wonder as well, if you look at the statistics, whether that right was also given to women. Because I think what's really interesting is in order to be able to fail 3 times, you probably need to be able to get the successful backing around 3 times. And
Great point.
And actually, like, statistically, I'm not sure if that's even possible with women's funding in terms of like the amount that goes into it. But also, you know, we see, for example, like the guy that started WeWork, and the entire WeWork scandal has just been given hundreds of millions to do something else that actually it's kind of like, and yet you're not backing like any women. And of course you would have learned so much from that, and of course doesn't take away from the fact that actually every single entrepreneur I've had sit here and talk about, you know, the most successful things have had people have had failures before, and they've learned so much from it. I just think it's really interesting that actually I'm not even sure that right is given to women in the same space.
And I think there's a broader point there about failure and women and marginalised people, in the sense that when I started doing How to Fail, and I've spoken about this before, but what I basically relied on friends and contacts to be my first 8 guests. And without exception, the women that I approached said, oh my God, I failed so many times. I just don't think I can whittle it down to 3. I asked people to come up with 3 failures to form the basis of the interview.
I know what this
I just don't think I can whittle it down. Every single man I approached, bar one, said, I just don't think I have failed. So not sure I'll be right for this podcast. And it was hilarious because it's like, actually, when I got them to do the interview, of course they'd failed.
Yeah,
and they gave really beautiful open interviews. It's just that they hadn't categorized it. They hadn't labeled it as failure.
Which is such a strength. And I also think it's like confirmation bias.
Yes.
So there's confirmation bias up, I believe, like with men, and kind of like down with women in terms of the way that like we think about something like failure.
I think if you are a cis, white, middle-class man, you are born into a world that is still made in your image.
Mm-hmm.
So you are likely to believe that you will be successful in that world because it's friendly to you. And if you encounter failure, you see it as a perfectly overcomable obstacle on your path to eventual guaranteed success. Mm-hmm. If you are a woman, a marginalised person, a person of colour, someone who lives with a chronic illness, you are not born into a friendly world. And therefore, that idea of confirmation bias down.
Right.
When you encounter a failure, you think, I'm a failure. Right. You internalise it rather than seeing it as something external that you can get over.
Right. So it's like extrapolating it out to everything in your life if you fail, and being like, I have proven via this one failure that I am a failure.
Exactly.
Rather than the opposite of being like, well, that's a little mistake. I guess I'll get on past that.
Yeah, but I'll be fine.
Exactly.
Yes,
And it's one of those things where it's like, how do we channel that in a way where you're right that the reason that is the case is because the world is set up in a certain way. So it's kind of like, it's probably harder for people to challenge that if they're not in that position, because, you know, it probably is, you know, life is probably predisposed slightly to make it harder for you then to succeed again.
That's why we need to change the world, Grace. And that's
okay.
And
sure.
that's
we'll add to my to-do list.
But I say that as a joke, but it also comes with serious intent, that I believe conversations like this are extremely important. And in my little corner, I'm doing what I can to reshape those kind of conversations. Yeah. And to talk really passionately about the fact that these people we shouldn't internalize failure for these reasons, as long as we've tried our best. That we as much as possible have to separate the outcome from the effort. And that's, we have to change the world. We have to change the structural inequalities, the systems that can feel so overwhelming. I personally am not sure that politics is the way to change the world in the way that we might aspire to do so. I actually think having influential conversations like this and constantly being aware of other people and their needs, and using whatever platforms we all have in our own lives to ensure that we give equal opportunities for people to find their voices. That's how we change. Just being aware and kind.
Yeah. No, I think that's really, really important. And also that kind of just like reframing of failure in terms of thinking that yes, it's still failure, and we don't need to like gloss over that, and we don't need to say no, failure doesn't exist, all of this. It's like it does exist, and it's a positive thing, which I think is really, really interesting.
Not always. Like, I have to say, there are some failures that are cataclysmic, and it would be monstrous for me to sit here and say,
right,
you can bounce back and it's positive. Some failures are awful and lifelong and will cause sadness and shame for many years, and you might never get over them. But the one thing I can guarantee is that you will learn something from them if you're open to that. And that can help you, that act of learning can help you be more at peace with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. When you think of your biggest failures, what do you think of?
Divorce is definitely up there, and I am still on a fertility journey, which, if you don't mind, I probably won't talk that much about because I don't want to get emotional.
Yeah.
Even though I think emotion is beautiful, but I feel like
to protect your
peace. It might derail this conversation because I'm still very much in it. But I haven't had children yet, and it's something that I really yearn for, and it's something that has been a battle of well over a decade. And it's not that I think I'm a failure for not having had a biological child, but it definitely feels like a lack and something that I want to ensure I've tried my hardest to make happen. And I know that there are so many different ways to be a parent. I'm so grateful to live in an age where that is possible. And I have many amazing children in my life. And one thing that this journey has taught me is that there are so many incredible people who are living different kinds of lives, and I'm so lucky that I've met them. But I do find that really hard, and it is something that, when I said earlier about living alongside a failure and feeling at peace with it, even though it makes you sad, it's one of those. It makes me, I'm really sad about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really, really powerful to say. And I also think that it's really, what's particularly powerful, and we won't go into kind of the details. I think that what's particularly powerful is the looking at failure within, and as you say, like living alongside it, having this kind of, not just saying, oh, well, failure's good, and this kind of like toxic positivity approach, but actually being able to have like a realistic approach and be like, and this makes me really fucking sad. And like, and I am working for this not to be the case. And like, this makes me, like all of this, but this, kind of that thought that you have to be able to be up within the down, and you have to be able to live your life, and you have to be able to find joy, and you have to be able to kind of create your peace alongside something. And that doesn't mean that you need to like toxically put something in a box and be like, oh no, I'm fine about it, because you don't need to be fine about everything. And actually it is toxic in lots of ways to not do that.
Well, thank you for being so understanding and also for giving me the space to say that. And I think you're completely right that actually, if you try and lock it all in a box and get on with living your life through the prism of good vibes only, actually, that's the worst thing you can do. That leads you to perspex screen territory where your best friend's knocking on the door being like, let me in. You lose touch with yourself.
Yeah, and it is suppression. I mean, it's there is real importance in being able to be open and honest and talk about things, but there is also, and you not everything we're going to be able to get over. Like, I think that's really important too. And if we kind of consider the only option of something we're not going to be able to get over is suppressing it, then we're just like setting ourselves up for failure. I also think there's something really valuable in the way that you've obviously kind of, a lot of your career has been around talking about failures. And I think we really see women in this way where kind of you talking about this journey, for example, we see women as having to divulge everything in order to be able to like justify, why they feel about something. And in order for us to be able to see them as vulnerable, and in order for us to be able to see someone as someone we want to follow online. And actually fighting against that and being like, I will talk about all the failure in the world. I do not want to talk about this, and I have every right not to talk about this, or in as much detail as I want to, and that is my right. And I think we don't give women that right. And that's
so true.
It's so true. Like the fact that you even need to kind of bring it up and then say, do you know what, I don't want to go into more detail. we do that all the time with women, especially in positions of power and positions of success. We're like, oh, but they must be cagey about this, because we have to be able to know everything about a woman's life in order to be able to consider them a success.
Yeah.
Which I just think is so wild.
Yeah, all for them to be owed the space that they're given.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have gone through pain and you have to carry scars.
And it has to be the worst story.
Yeah. And I think that's such an interesting point. And I am a natural sharer. I believe that vulnerability and sharing is the source of all true connection. And it is immensely important to me. And I've also come to realize that there is a difference between secrecy and privacy. I'm not being secret about anything, but I do reserve the right to be private about certain things.
Absolutely.
Especially when they involve other people. And I'm also a big believer in this culture of immediacy that we live in. I don't need to know how I feel about every single thing immediately. And a lot of the time, if it's a really big thing, I won't know. And so I know now that I need to give myself a grace period of understanding what it means before I feel that I will have anything of use or value to share. I need that, the grace of hindsight sometimes to do that. And I also feel that I love my online community. That sounds like such a pretentious thing to say, but I like the people who follow me on Instagram. I get such an enormous amount from them.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to be a kind and uplifting presence in their lives as much as possible. And actually, if I'm having a bad day about something, I don't always think I should share this so that I'm being real. I actually sometimes think I'm not going to share this online because I don't want to drag other people down on this particular day. There's sometimes I will, and sometimes there's a time and place. But a lot of the time, I think there's great validity to be had in understanding, no, I can go to my close circle with that and they'll get me. And that's where I'll do my processing. And I don't need to make someone else feel bad or triggered because I'm sharing it.
Yeah, I think all of that is true. And I think that the ability to be vulnerable without needing to divulge every piece of information is really, really important, because I think especially once you start being vulnerable, there's definitely, especially as a woman, there's definitely a reward mechanism for it online. And that's actually, I lost myself through that hugely.
Did you?
I'm naturally like very much a sharer. I'll like walk into a room of people I've never met before and I'll be like, I went on the worst date last night, and I'll like happily, I'll give all the details and I'll be like, oh, you shouldn't have said that. Like that person's definitely going to go to, and it's naturally who I am. And I spent years and years essentially doing that, and the more I shared, the more I was rewarded for it. And I also realized the more I completely stripped myself of like my right to privacy. But because it was something where people liked it and I made money from it and people thought they knew me and therefore they liked me because they could see my vulnerabilities, I was able to be successful through that. And they just got to a point where I completely lost myself in that, and I was actually like, no. And now I don't, and this is just a personal choice, I don't share any of my personal life online, really. I don't share any kind of big things that happen to me, really, in terms of if I don't think it's relevant. Because it's actually, I saw how much it made me see myself as like a commodity, that people would only like me as a successful woman if they saw all of my vulnerabilities and the bad thing that happened to me.
The commodity of a woman's pain.
It completely took over my life. And I think that just to be able to, it's taken a lot, and it still takes a lot. Every time, like, something really, something really traumatic happened, for example, like last week. And I was like, I should probably talk about it, otherwise it doesn't explain why, I haven't been online and I haven't been sharing these things. And actually, if you say something mean to me this week, I will cry. And like all of those things. But actually, then just being like, no, I do not only deserve people's respect and kindness and time and whatever because I went through that, or because I've shared that and because they know about that. That should be a given anyway. And I will not act any differently, and I will not give people the right to only see me as that or see me as someone to be kind to, or any of these things because of those things. And I think that was one of the most powerful things I ever did for myself. Just being like,
no. And how do you enjoy your online presence now? I mean, I do as a consumer. Okay, so what are your tips for curating that safe space for yourself?
It's really, really interesting, and I don't think I have like clear ring fencing. I think I operate almost entirely off a gut feeling. And I think that the only reason I went against my gut feeling for so long was because it rewarded me so heavily. Like, I made a lot of money. I had a lot of kind of really invested following who knew about my relationships and my life and all of these things that they were really, you know, they responded really well to. So I kind of was able to suppress that because my own gut feeling was counteracted by this gut feeling of, well, I like X, Y, and Z that I'm getting from it.
Yeah.
And so I guess now what I do is it's very much this kind of feeling of, it's not necessarily like, does this fit my brand? Because I'm sure, as you'll see if you follow me on kind of socials, like, I don't really wholly care about that. I don't tend to care too much about like coming across as a founder versus just doing the job and all of these things, which I definitely used to. I think I enjoy it more. I think I had this illusion that I would enjoy it less because people would like me less and give me less time because they wouldn't know about my life. And I actually enjoy it more because that's not the sole purpose of my life.
Yeah.
And I don't need to give more to get more. It's kind of, this is what
I mean,
you get to know.
I just need you to post your wardrobe all the time, which I love your outfit TikToks.
Thank you.
Yeah, never
Thanks
stop
so
doing
much.
those.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Well,
Because
those
they're
can
always funny
substitute.
as well. You've always got a sense of humour, which is, I think, such an amazing thing to have online.
You.
Like, yeah.
Well, it's really interesting because I also get I'd say for every like business YouTube video or story or anything I post, like there will also be people who are like, oh, I miss the fun Grace, like you used to be like this. It's like, she's still here.
Yeah.
She just has decided that actually like that right is reserved for, you know, people around me. And that's not like, I don't want that to come across as like a mean thing and being like, you don't have the right to that. People who have, especially people who have supported me, like, I'm so, so grateful, but it cannot be I cannot be giving away myself in order to make that happen. And I think recognize it. And there are some people who can definitely do both. I'm not saying that everyone who talks about their private life online is, you know, kind of selling their soul for it. Not at all. But for me, that was the effect it had. So it was about acknowledging that actually like maybe like the money and stuff and like the engagement and stuff probably like wasn't quite worth it for me. But I think also it's something that I've only really noticed in hindsight, and just being able to come to terms with the fact that like there is a percentage of people who will think that the fun Grace is gone and I'm like really boring, which is fine.
Well,
like,
anytime you think of them, think of me being like, oh, look at her, look at her neutral jacket.
Yeah, great, I will. That's literally just going to be what's going to pop to my head at all times. To round it off, I'd love to know what, if any, it can be anyone that comes to mind or any lesson that comes to mind, what the biggest things are that you've learnt from your podcast and interviewing such incredible people about, I guess, the unseen areas of their life.
Well, big question, but there's a few answers. I think the podcast guest who has most influenced me on a personal level is Mo Gaudat.
I can understand that, yeah.
He was on season 4 of the podcast, so very early on. And it was just ahead of the publication of his book, Soul for Happy in the UK. And
so very early in his career.
Very
as well.
early, yeah. I always like to be like, by the way, I go in first. I go in first.
I will be listening. That will be added. I will be clicking the plus.
It's a phenomenal episode because of him, because of how extraordinary he was. So I didn't have many formed expectations going into that interview. I'd read his book and I knew it was going to be a really interesting conversation. But he is such an extraordinary, soulful man who also comes from this engineering statistical background. And the combination of the two, he applied to the problem of happiness, and he claims that he can make any person happy. And has developed an algorithm for happiness, which is all about managing our expectation, essentially. And he went through a really traumatic life event when his beloved son, Ali, died at the age of 21 during a routine operation. And he had to put his own algorithm for happiness to use in one of the worst situations you can possibly imagine. And he explained it to me like this. He said, for weeks after Ali died, I would wake up and the tears were streaming down my cheeks. And my first thought on waking would be, Ali died. He died. And after a few months of that, he was like, I can't carry on living with that weight of grief. And he woke up every morning and he was still crying. And his first thought was still, Ali died. but he added, and he also lived. And within that second half of that sentence was 21 years of father-son love, of joy, of playfulness, of a family life, and it enabled him to carry on living. And that, for me, was such an emotional and extraordinary, shape-shifting thing to hear, because it's all about your thoughts and managing your thoughts and how you speak to yourself. And Mo taught me how to do that. And he has this thing where he calls his brain Becky after a girl at his school who was really annoying and constantly pointing out the things that would go wrong. And he says that when his brain is caught on that anxious narrative loop of saying, you're a failure, you're a terrible parent, your daughter doesn't love you anymore, you forgot to turn the toaster off this morning, he stops himself and says, Becky, where is your objective evidence for that assertion? Because if you don't have objective evidence for that assertion, I'd love you to take that negative thought and replace it with a positive one. And in that way, you can train yourself to be happier. And in that way, you can train yourself to deal with failure. Because you can say to your Becky brain, why are you telling me I'm a failure? I'm not a failure. I've got this. Thank you for your concern. But do you know what? I've got this. And it's a way of sort of just slightly distancing yourself from that anxious narrative loop. That's been genuinely like life-changing for me. And then there's another piece of advice that came from Deborah Frances White, who is the host of the Guilty Feminist podcast. And she has a background in acting and theatre, and she used to do improv classes. And she talks about how there was this one improv exercise where you had to keep improvising on stage, and if anyone in the audience was bored, they would just walk out of the room. So you had to keep like coming up with stuff to keep people interested.
That's like my worst nightmare.
Awful
That's like
nightmare.
my equivalent to like realising I'm completely naked in public.
Yeah, hideous. And she said that the times when people walked out of the room, actually, they were difficult, but they were very, very helpful because she acquired data about what worked. So all failure is data acquisition. Anytime you fail at something, you can acquire necessary data for the next time or for personal growth. And you could apply that to so many areas of life. We're talking at a time when Liz Truss has just stepped down as Prime Minister. Potentially the data that she acquired from that failure was that she was in the wrong job.
Yes,
Go find another job that is better suited to your skills. I, as I've mentioned, met my husband on Hinge. I went through so many dates which were disappointing, but I did acquire data about what I wanted in someone and how to do dates better. And that led me to Justin, and I'm so grateful for that. So all failure can be data acquisition has really helped me too.
I love those two. I will be taking those and using them in my life. I have this little note on my notes app, which is just like, you know, when like something makes you feel something, like you're listening to something and it's a quote or it's someone talking about something, like, and it really makes you stop and feel something. I have this like little note that I just add all of those things to, so that at some point I can just like go back and scroll through it, or if I'm having like a really bad day, or if I just need some grounding, whatever it might be. And those will be going straight in the notes.
Thank you. This is why you're such a good planner. This is the equivalent of the Spotify favourite podcast episode list. Thank you.
You can see how I organise every part of my life. But I equally cannot deal with a problem without putting it into a pre-made table, which I also have on my document. So like there's probably something wrong there.
No, I think that sounds really, I wish I was more like that. Excel spreadsheets terrify me.
Yeah.
Your naked dream is my Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, really? My Excel spreadsheet is my heaven.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been fantastic. You're amazing.
I've loved it. Thank you so much for having me.